Nokko is the brand new Warframe, and honestly, when I first saw him, I was not impressed to say the least, with many of you feeling the same way. However, oh boy, is this dude borderline broken. No clickbait. He deals tens of millions of damage, constant invisibility, infinite energy, crowd control, viral priming, and even if you ever take fatal damage, you're still never gonna die anyway. So, in this Warframe guide, I'm gonna tell you everything you need to know about Nokko, and I have some disgusting builds prepared. Big shoutouts to all our generous channel members, and now let's jump right into it. First of all, how do you even get Nokko yourself? Well, you will have to have the new war quest finished, otherwise you will not have access. Once that's done though, all you need to do is go into Fortuna, turn around and go into this vent right here, where you will find Nightcap, the new NPC, and in his shop you can then buy Nokko's blueprint plus the components, you know, the standard stuff whenever a new Warframe comes out. In order to rank up with him and unlock all of this in the first place, you will have to do bounties in the new Valis Undermine style set that also came with this update, and the good thing is, Nokko and his components can also be acquired as drops from those bounties. My personal Nokko was given to me by the Warframe developers as part of the Warframe Creator Program, so big shoutouts to DE for that, making it possible that I can bring you this video early. But now that you know how you can farm Nokko for yourself, let's next, as per usual, talk about what the man can do. Let's go over his abilities. Now, usually, in my Warframe guides, I start out with the passive, however here I first want to jump in with his first ability right away. This one is called Stinkbrain, which is also his helmet ability, so you can put that on all other frames if you like. And what this does is actually pretty straightforward. You throw out a fungus ball, and wherever that lands, it will grow a mushroom that pulsates every 3 seconds, and with each pulse, it will deal AoE viral damage and also force proc viral on all the enemies it hits, which is pretty cool for viral priming purposes. However, the damage in and of itself is nothing to write home about. If you want to, you can also jump onto the mushroom, which will then emit a pulse every time you land on it, making it faster, and you can have up to 3 of those on the field at the same time. However, viral priming is not the only thing that this does. In addition to that, every enemy hit by one of those viral pulses will also fall asleep and be instantly open for melee finishers. This is ridiculously strong, as we're going to see a bit later in the build section, and also, it gives Nokko great crowd controlling capabilities for mission types like interception, mobile defense, you know, any type of mission where you just need to hold out for a set amount of time. But let it be known, if you take Nokko into a normal defense mission, where you actually want the enemies to come to you as fast as possible, you could screw over your team big time if you just slow down all the enemies and drag out the mission progress, so keep that one in mind, don't be annoying with this. Ability number 2 goes by the name Brightbonnet, Brightbonnet, I don't know how to pronounce it, but essentially this one is a second type of mushroom, but this one has other capabilities, namely that it's gonna give you and all allies in range an ability strength buff, which is quite a rare type of buff and therefore very much appreciated, and also with every pulse it regenerates a bit of your energy. So if you want to fill up your energy at the beginning of a mission, I would recommend just throw one down and jump a couple of times, so you can start your mission with maximum juice. Ability number 3 is called Reroot, and if I'm being perfectly honest, right, it's day 1, I might be missing some major points here, but from what I've seen so far, this one is really not all that impressive, and definitely the one where you would put in something else from the helmet. See, what happens here is, you turn yourself into one of your little sprawlings. While you're running around in the sprawling form, you are completely and utterly invincible, so this is kind of sort of your panic button, and there will also be little orbs spawning that, if picked up, increase your health and shields for you and nearby allies. All in all, this does not sound all too bad, but the problem is, while you are in this sprawling form, you can essentially not do anything to the enemies, and in addition, this whole invincibility thing that it gives you isn't really all too powerful because of Nokko's passive that I want to talk about next. See, what Nokko's passive makes is that if you take fatal damage, then if you have no mushrooms on the field, you're just gonna die instantly. But if you have at least one mushroom on the field, then you're not gonna die, but instead, you're also gonna turn into a Sprawdling, and if you manage to run towards a mushroom before the timer runs out, you're just gonna come back to life, and not just that, you're also gonna be given a generous, I think 7 or 8 seconds of complete and utter invincibility. So yeah, if you ask me, there's not really a point in using your third ability to become invincible in a tricky situation. You could just let yourself die, run to the next mushroom, and come back to life with the help of your passive. But what is definitely very necessary is his fourth ability, Sporespring, because this one is, without exaggeration, one of the most ridiculous damage-dealing abilities in the entire game. When you activate it, you also throw out one of these balls, however, this one does not grow a mushroom, but rather bounces around in the vicinity, to be precise, a total of 10 bounces before it disappears. Whenever it bounces on one of your mushrooms, it also makes them pulsate faster as if you jump onto them. However, what's much more interesting is, it can also bounce on enemies, and if it does that, it deals a ton of toxin damage, also force-proccing a toxin status effect. And not just that, this is one of the very rare abilities that actually can crit, with a base crit chance of 100%, so it always crits. The crit damage multiplier, I don't know, we're probably gonna have to wait for the wiki entry because I couldn't find it anywhere. However, with every bounce, the crit chance increases by another 25%, meaning with the last bounces, this bad boy is gonna deal red crits, which is crazy if you think about it. And what would also be crazy is if you could maybe give the video a like, because it always helps me big time with the YouTube algorithm, so cheers so much for your support. But yeah, that would be it for his abilities. Before we jump into the builds though, let's also quickly talk about how to actually play him in practice. See, when the mission starts, the first thing I would recommend is put down your 2 and jump a bit on it to max out your energy right off the bat. This will also give you the ability strength bonus, so if you have a helmet ability that requires ability strength, I would make sure to cast it while still under the influence of this buff. And once you get into combat, the only thing you really need to do is spam your mushrooms and throw out your 4 to absolutely annihilate everything. That's literally all you need to do. If you take fatal damage, just go to one of your mushrooms and you come back to life, and whichever weapons you use, or if you want to use them at all, that's completely up to you. But now, let's come to the chapter that you've all been waiting for, and that would be the build section. In today's video, I have 2 different builds prepared for you, with a little bit of variation. The first one is the maximum damage build that just annihilates absolutely everything, and the second one is a variation of it that is more focused on supporting the team and crowd controlling the enemies. Let's start out with the Big Bada Boom build though, where first of all, I want to get back to the 4th ability and the fact that it crits. This is actually the most important factor about the entire build. Here's what I mean. See, while at this point in time we do not know what the critical multiplier of these hits is, the fact alone that they crit means we can use flat crit damage buffs to massively amp up the damage that this deals. For example, if we use a companion that has a weapon with a minimum of 50% crit chance, we can put Tenacious Bond onto the companion, which will increase our crit damage by 1.2x. And secondly, there is a very beloved arcane of mine called Arcane Crepuscular, which makes it that whenever you're invisible, you're A, gaining ability strength, and B, you get another flat 3 times crit damage bonus on top, meaning if you stack both of these crit damage bonuses, you're gonna have plus 4.2 times more crit damage, regardless on what the base is. So even if the base crit damage multiplier of the 4 was very low, going for these 2 bonuses skyrockets our damage into oblivion, and that is a mechanic that we're definitely gonna take advantage of with this build. Let's look at how to do this. First of all, let's talk about our helmet ability, where we have multiple options of course, but I have 2 definite favorites here. The first one would be relatively uncreative in the form of Roar, which not only increases the base damage of our ability, but also counts as faction damage bonus, and given the fact that you force proc Toxin with your 4, even if the enemy doesn't instantly die from the flat damage, this makes the ensuing Toxin procs even stronger, so if you want to have the biggest numbers, I think Roar would be the one to go for. However, as we initially said, The 4 deals damage by having this ball bounce between enemies, and if you pull the enemies closer together, that means the ball bounces faster between the enemies and emits its damaging AoEs in much more of a rapid succession. So what we can also do is just use a grouping ability. This is viable too. However, when you want to go for a grouping ability, I would definitely recommend making it Chorus Ensnare, because for whatever reason, if you throw the ball at an enemy and the enemy is currently in a ragdoll status, then the ball will not trigger any hit and just bounce away without dealing damage, which means if you go for Mag's Pull or Nidus's Larva, then the enemies get ragdolled and your ball will just not hit them at all. Not sure if that's intentional, however, that is how it is at the point of making this video, and if you go for Ensnare, that they're not ragdolled and the ball can instantly deal damage once it makes contact. But another thing that you could potentially do would be not use a Helminth ability for the grouping, but instead the Sciatid as your secondary weapon. This one can group up the enemies for you, and that would give you the ability to have both Roar as your Helminth ability plus the grouping at the same time. Let's also take a look at the Archon shards, where this one is actually pretty straightforward. We're gonna go with 2 Tau Forged yellows for the casting speed. If you wanted to, 2 normal yellows would also do, but I would go for a bit of casting speed because it makes you throw out all those balls just significantly faster and it's much more convenient. Next, I went for 2 red ones. These 2 here are into ability duration because genuinely, I don't think we need much more strength, right? The damage is high enough and duration is just more comfy, but they're kind of flex slots. You don't necessarily need them. You could replace them with anything else. And in the final one, I went for a green shard that increases the amount of corrosive procs that we can deal to a maximum of 13, allowing us to almost full strip enemy armor. And we're gonna get back to that as we talk about the build now. This right here would be one example build for the maximum damage approach. As we previously said, we go for Arcane Crepuscular to give us plus 3 times final crit damage. However, you need to be invisible to gain this effect, so in order to do that, what we go for here is use Arcane Trickery. This one can turn you invisible for 30 seconds on a finisher kill, which is a perfect synergy with our first ability, because remember what we said, this one instantly opens up all the enemies in the AoE to finisher kills. And to reinforce that even further, as a weapon we use the Skiayati, Umbra's Katana, because this one has a passive that gives you another 5 seconds of invisibility on top whenever you take out an enemy with a finisher. So in combination with Arcane Trickery, this should give you constant invisibility. However, if you don't like this approach, one thing you could also do, this one is more convenient and more consistent, you could go for Shade as a companion, because Shade can constantly keep you invisible while there are enemies nearby and you're not using weapons. This is a great synergy because when we throw out our abilities, we're not even using weapons for our damage. However, if you wanted to use your secondary, the Sciatid, to do the grouping for you, then the Shade variant wouldn't work because using the Sciatid as a weapon would break the invisibility from Shade. So pick and choose whichever method you like more. As for the main portion of the build, in the aura slot, it doesn't really matter all that much. I basically used Growing Power as a placeholder right here. You could use whatever you like, maybe Corrosive Projection to make the enemies a bit softer. In the Excellent slot, it also doesn't matter. I went for Prime Sure-Footed because if you're invisible, then the only thing that could really hit you off guard is if you take like an AoE that knocks you down or something. This one prevents that from happening. But if you wanted to save up some forma, you could also do the radical act of just leaving this one open. It won't hurt the build at all. Then we go for Prime Flow to give more maximum energy, Umbral Intensify for the ability strength, because, the more ability strength you have, the more damage you deal. One important thing to mention here is the main portion of our damage is going to be our 4, so one thing we could do is also go for Precision Intensify, which would give the 4 in specific more damage. However, for this build, Umbral Intensify is the better option because this one improves the damage buff that we get from our 2. It also improves the damage buff that we get from the Infused Roar ability, so overall it makes the 4 deal more damage by buffing up the other 2, which in turn then will buff the 4 even further. If, however, instead of Roar you go for a grouping ability that doesn't need ability strength, then replacing Umbral Intensify with the Precision version is actually the better choice. Up next, even more ability strength with Transient Fortitude and Blind Rage. Good thing here being that the negative efficiency doesn't hurt us at all because we gain infinite energy from our second ability. And the rest is just mainly range, with overextended, stretch, augur, reach. If you wanted to, you could even go for cunning drift in the Exilus, but it's not necessary. Given our 2 mushrooms here, plus the ultimate ability, all the range in the world. And finally, we go for Archon Continuity, which is also a great synergy for Nokko, because remember, he force procs Toxin with his 4th ability, meaning with Archon Continuity, you force proc Corrosive at the same time, which is also the reason that we used 1 green Archon shard so we can inflict even more corrosive status effects, allowing us to effectively armor strip the enemy with our 4th ability, well, in case they live long enough to see that happening. Just one thing that I noticed here, and I'm also not sure if this is supposed to be this way or if it's a bug. If you instantly take out the enemy with the first hit of your 4th ability, it will only force proc the Toxin and not the additional corrosive. This one is only applied if the enemy survives the first contact with the ball. And then, before we end the video, I also have a second build which is kinda sorta similar, right? Kinda sorta the same. This one, I called it more of a support build because we don't go for all that much ability strength. You can also subsume whichever skill you want. This build mainly focuses on supporting the team with your 2 mushrooms right here, and that's also why we have maximum range, a lot of duration in comparison to the previous build, and we also make Nokko a little bit more shield tanky by going for Primed Redirection as well as Adaptation and Arcane Aegis. This way we can keep Nokko alive a bit longer, make the whole thing more convenient. All in all though, I would say the invisible damage dealing build is by far the coolest option to play him. And if you also want to know about the best Warframes in the entire game, then you can find that list right here. Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demon Norzel, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nostalix Gaming, Turtlepeer, Underkaneo 2, Scalabauza, Mihaki, Phil the Meme, Socrates the Almighty Rat, Leo Morizaki, Shadow Lockhart, Hantares, Patrosader, Charloloxon, Boomea1, Mr. Games Plays, Zave, Awindai, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.